one thing is that this article, this main incriminating article, is rather old. It's from 2012.
Yeah.
And it's not a big news for somebody following these, as they call them, debates about euthanasia, for instance, abortion and so on, because they are kind of like interconnected. The idea that infanticide is morally justifiable is not new in modern West. You have, for instance, people like Peter Singer, who is, I think, he's still a Princeton professor of philosophy, who is about, as far as I know, about as radical as authors, this Francesca Minerva and Ghibellini. As radical as them, although he's saying this from a long time ago, when those things were maybe not so easy to say publicly.
Yeah, he was in the 1970s. I looked him up. I wondered, in fact, if Minerva had been influenced by him, because I think they were both she was in Australia, and I think, was he lecturing in Australia or something, or is he maybe all based in America?
He's Australian, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
so I know that the article is from 2012, and I know that initially after the article there was a lot of debate about it. But then they also produced another article in 2016 to do with partial birth abortion, and it followed the same trajectory of thought.
Yeah.
So just to set it up, the first article was in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2012, and it was by Francesca Minerva and Alberto Ghibellini. Yeah, I couldn't say his name. But anyway, then they produced a clarification because they were pretty shocked. That was the thing. They were pretty shocked at the reaction.
Yeah, I'm shocked that they were shocked. Yeah, I don't really think they were so shocked, because article was probably meant to cause a fuss. Maybe by editors, maybe they wasn't aware that it will be publicly accessible, because most of the scientific articles are rather expensive. I don't know about this journal, but it is customary that those articles are not publicly accessible. So the authors, as I gather, were surprised that they were put in a public spotlight, as if that they were in some way entitled not to be put in the public, but they will keep discussion in academic settings.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was her clarification, Minerva's clarification 36 hours later on a local radio station, was that this was intended for academic circles only, as if, the ordinary plebs, couldn't possibly understand academic language.
Well, yeah, this is, I will try to skip referring to them in person, because I don't want to promote them.
Okay, sure.
No, I'm talking about myself, of course, because the thing is, this is academic bullshit. I am not a tenured professor, but I graduated philosophy, and I studied philosophy for 23 years, 25 years now. This has very little to do with what was considered to be philosophy until relatively recently, to mid-20th century. This would be called something like philosophy for children, although the children with rather sinister minds, for various reasons. First, about lingo of this article. This is very, it is written in very simple terms. I'll give you an example of, for instance, the way the Hegel wrote, or Schelling, or, God forbid, Heidegger, is sometimes almost impenetrable, for various reasons. Partly because really they go very deep into, let's say, into reflection on various, what we would call philosophical problems. That is, the problems that kind of like push us to the very brim of our logical capacity. And for this reason, philosophical texts from Aristotle onwards can tend to be extremely difficult to comprehend. But I never recall Hegel or somebody like that say that he wrote only for academics. He just wrote. He thought this is the way it can be expressed, and if you can get it, you can get it. If you can't, well, not his problem. But these guys, to tell them that this is something that public cannot grasp, it's a pure bullshit. I can't use any more polite word, any politer word than that, because it is very simplistic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the reasoning is very simplistic. Essentially what they're doing is they're extending the logic to its ultimate conclusion, you know.
Yes.
And actually they're acknowledging that it's bidirectional in the sense that it can prove either extreme. You know, you can either prove pro-life or pro-abortion from going along the extreme of the logic. Because if personhood doesn't exist in the neonatal, then it doesn't exist in the fetus. But you can say then, if that means then that the neonatal could be killed, and that's why it justifies the fetus being killed, then you can actually also say that if a lack of personhood, if it's anathema to the public to think that a neonatal could be killed even if they have a lack of personhood, then one can extend the logic backwards and say that it should be anathema to kill the fetus for the exact same reason.
Yes. For a benefit of our listeners, so we started in medias res. I'll just give the abstract of the article. I'll read it and we can start from there. So they say, I will quote 3 points they want to address in this. So quote, they want to show that both fetuses and newborns do not have the same moral status as actual persons. 2. The fact that both are potential persons is morally irrelevant. And 3. That adoption is not always in the best interest of actual people. And they argue that what we call after-birth abortion, we meaning them because this is their term, they pride themselves of inventing it, that is, in the brackets, killing a newborn, so that we don't get confused, should be permissible in all the cases where abortion is, including cases where the newborn is not disabled. So the purpose of the article is to just morally, not only morally, but even, I would say, meta-institutionally demonstrate that infanticide or killing of infant child is permissible. This is the purpose of the article. And the logic, as you said, what they do is push boundaries of logic. That is, the boundaries, better to say, the boundaries of their assumption to their logical end. And this is very simple, and this is very easy to do, in fact. What is not easy to do, and what they skipped and omitted doing, is checking the validity of their assumptions, I think.
You mean the personhood assumptions?
Yes, among other things, but mainly personhood, what the person is. They never try to investigate, at least in this article, what the person means. It is obvious from their argument that for them, the person is a being that is capable to evaluate, to set aims, to increase its happiness. And this is, yeah.
No, yeah, I was just going to say that they seem to have just, latched onto definitions of personhood that have been in existence, like say from Singer in the 1970s. And right the way through, the definitions of personhood seem to be so simplistic to me in terms of why they haven't been challenged. That a person should have a continuity of experience in order to define personhood, or that there should be the ability to, what Singer said, the ability to distinguish between pain and pleasure. But they're actually saying almost as if it's an articulation is required, as opposed to, the newborn's ability to feel pain and pleasure is there, but it's the articulation is absent. So to me, it doesn't make sense, It's a very flimsy definition of personhood.
It's I wouldn't call it a definition at all. I would call it instrumental concept. The concept you use to make your argument work. And sometimes in philosophy this was done. For instance, Aristotle was very prone to doing these things, to take a concept definition of something and then use it to argue around the problem, but provisionally only, for a heuristic purpose, to come to a deeper and more correct concept. And they stay on this superficial level, but their assumption is that human being is a biological machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what they call person is in fact consciousness. And consciousness, despite what many people today believe, is a materialistic notion. Because today, especially in a New Age infected thought, consciousness is understood as some kind of what in previous ages was called soul or even spirit. It is not. Consciousness is a secondary phenomena. It's a reflection. Reflection in the mirror is a good symbol of consciousness. That is, it is the ability of the person to observe itself from the outside. That is, consciousness, for instance, let's say that our consciousness of ourselves in this sense grows with age. You are constantly revising your life and trying to depict who you are from the things you did, and so on and so forth. And it is to some extent true that we do discover ourselves through lives. We are not in an initial point of the beginning of our lives, of young age. We are not really aware of ourselves. Everybody who has any degree of maturity knows this. People discover a whole lot of things about themselves. Some people don't, but most are. And consciousness in this sense, but in the sense these authors use it, it's a completely abstract consciousness of the biological apparatus that at some point starts to recur back to itself. It starts to recognize, this gives me pain, this gives me pleasure. And then when it goes to, let's call it higher point, it can make plans and it can make some kind of systems of aims that we can call its trajectory through life, choosing some kind of purpose and so on. So it is radically subjectivist, and it is radically materialistic, and it is in fact comes from I think from this skeptical philosophy, the philosophy that is based on the principle that we cannot know anything reliable about reality, so we must always approach everything with a kind of standpoint of suspension of judgment, of simply observing our sense experience and describing it and trying to extract some provisional rules, but never arriving to what would be traditionally called truth. That is one stable point that kind of like serves as a foundation of everything. And this kind of thinking is a radical expression of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, so you're saying that consciousness, or maybe it's used now instead of the word soul, as a kind of a very minor modification, like, of the possibility of there being a soul. Is that what you mean?
Yes, it is. Consciousness is the difference between consciousness and the soul is a difference, logical difference between substance and the activity of substance.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, substance is a being. I mean, I don't like that. In Greek, it's word ousia. Substance is from substantia, a Latin translation of this word, made by Cicero, and is widely used in philosophy. Now, something that is substantial is something that can be an answer to the question, what is it? Energy or activity of the substance is what proceeds from it. Now, consciousness cannot really be a substance, because it is always consciousness of something. It is kind of like projection. There has to be one previous moment, something that is more fundamental than consciousness that projects this consciousness. And they don't take this into account. they probably think that this is a organism, biological organism that gives birth to consciousness, in the sense that, in an evolutionary sense, a random, let's say, pieces of this whole we call human body an organism, kind of like give birth to rational thought. Brain starts working, and then brain, which is material thing, slowly becomes aware of itself. There was to illustrate this abstract point, I can recur to one thing. One pedophile. I read an article by a guy who called himself a virtuous pedophile. That is a pedophile that is a pedophile but doesn't act like pedophile, supposedly. To cut the long story short, at one point he said that his brain is like that there is nothing he can do, or whatever, however you put it, how he became pedophile is not important. It is important that his brain is hard now, and he can't be anything else. Yeah. So you have a situation of person hiding behind his own brain.
Yeah.
Because brain is everything that is material from the point of view of personhood proper, or the soul, which are convertible terms in my opinion. Human soul and human person. Everything that is material is outside it. So its body is in a way outside it, because inside and outside are terms that are not primarily spatial but more ontological. The thing that is always extrinsic, always on the outside, is something that cannot have cause in itself, that has to be caused by something else. So for instance, the brain cannot, in this logic I apply, cannot give birth to personhood, because it works as all things, material things, on outside stimuli. There has to be something that is substantial and that is subsistent, that can stand for itself, and this kind of thing cannot be material. Now,
yeah, you have said there that you equate personhood with soul, and I would agree with that point. And it is obvious that the difference between these philosophers, various philosophers, is that they actually deny the existence of soul. So, therefore, I feel that in a way it's almost unbridgeable to reach them, because it's people with such completely different perspectives, that it's not possible to. We're coming from such completely different standpoints, original standpoints, from the origin of the actual point of view. The origins of the point of views are so far apart that whereas one can possibly understand, maybe intellectually, the points of view that they're making, maybe in terms of linguistics or extension of rationale or whatever, they would look at somebody who would say that there is a soul as being foolish. I mean, I was surprised when I was reading up about some of this that I don't know if you've ever heard of Steven Pinker. Have you heard of him? He's kind of like a pop psychologist, really. He's written a lot of books, and his book Enlightenment Now is very popular. But he actually wrote in the 1990s about this issue and said that mothers who kill their newborns should not be judged harshly because the newborn has no personhood. And yet he's considered like a very perky, upbeat kind of modern, for the people, evolutionary and cognitive psychologist. But what his point was, he said that newborns have no more personhood than mice, was one of the things he said. So the point is that these very intelligent people, these otherwise very intelligent people, regard somebody who thinks that there is an a priori existing soul that is there present in the fetus as being so completely incorrect that they almost can't have a conversation.
I don't think we can have a conversation. I agree with you 100%, because when someone goes to this extremity, there is in fact an unbridgeable gap. between them, but not between them and somebody like me, but between them and people who still have some grasp of reality. Because the thing is, most of the talking about soul, about being and the substances and so on and so forth, a lot of people would not understand what I am talking about. I would have to go to a great length to explain. But this is because I am talking from the perspective of philosophers that reflected on human experience. But people have experiences. People know that infanticide is not good. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they cannot always explain why doesn't make their knowledge any less valuable. Because the problem is when arguing with people like this. Although I don't think this kind of people there is any sense in arguing with them, but still. The problem is when you argue from the point of normalcy. If they ask you what is normalcy, you will be hard-pressed for an answer. That's because you take it for granted. Some principles that are in human nature, we take for granted, most of them. The better they work, I think the more we take them for granted. Whereas this kind of people, they live in some kind of abstract world of abstract concepts. And this world of abstract concept is systematic. It's a kind of like map of meaning for them. And they, in this system of theirs, they have answer to everything. Only this system has absolutely no touch with reality. Because once you have consequent logic that puts you in position that you see nothing objectionable, for instance, in eating dead human flesh, something that I think Richard Dawkins said that, and there is guy Pierce, posthumanist, who is advocate of destroying the pain, all pain in human life by means of biologically and cybernetically modifying humans. And he said that by his logic there is nothing morally objectionable on eating human. Now 90% of the people, I think, you ask, will say he's crazy. And when you ask them why is he crazy, they probably won't have an answer. They'll need to think about it. Think about it real hard. And there is an answer. There is a rational, in the end, I believe you can rationally demonstrate guy is a lunatic. But it's not easy because you are arguing from the standpoint of reality. They are not arguing from the standpoint of reality. That's the issue.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here, okay? And it's just to put some historical perspective that surprised me. Researching infanticide, I found that actually infanticide has been in existence. It appears historically for a very, very long time. And that, one would like to think that there was a native revulsion in the human being to infanticide, or, which is essentially what after birth abortion is, the kind of a subtle and hygienic term for such a thing. That actually, when you look back in history, we are told, I don't know if it's exactly true, that infanticide has been not the exception, but rather the rule, and that almost every society has had infanticide, and that sometimes up to 50%, and even they say, like in the Inuits, for example, 80%. So what I'm saying really is that some of these bioethicists, since the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, have said that what happened was that there was a tide of moral revulsion that came essentially from the Christian ethic. That's what they're saying, that this almost interrupted a natural human activity.
Yes, they are neo-pagan philosophers. The problem with paganism is that people have, in my opinion, at least have a pretty strange romantic view of those pagan religions and pagan civilizations. They were different, of course. For instance, Romans and Greeks, you can't really go compare them with South American civilizations that were eradicated by Europeans. They were radically different, and they had to avoid these principles that we would now call completely obnoxious and horrible. But my opinion is that most, if not all, principles we live by are Christian principles, and this is a Christian civilization that is kind of like tumbling at its core, and you have these intellectual strains trying to attack it and to revert back to pre-Christian ethos, but I don't see anything good in it. No. And this is why I insist. Because people try to, when they argue with people like these two, people who are against abortion or infanticide, they like to stay clear of the church. They like to not to be mixed up with some kind of any form of religious thought, any concrete moral idea. They're just kind of like arguing from their own conscience. I think this is illusion. You have to argue from positive precepts, and precepts that are on collision course with this are Christian. Platon, maybe Platonic. I mean, you have advocacy of infanticide in Plato also, although
in Aristotle. Also in Aristotle.
Yeah, but you'll never hear them. You'll never hear them praise it. They don't consider it something good.
I did read that Aristotle recommended exposure in the case of deformity, which surprised me. You know, exposure was one of the main practices for infanticide.
Yeah.
But strangely enough, they said, what I saw was that in the ancient Egyptian religion, they were extremely against infanticide or any attempt to remove the child from the womb or to abort. You know, this was very important to them. And in actual fact, there used to be a big practice of rescuing foundlings from the spoil heap of other cultures who had exposed infants to die, you know, so it wasn't universal, obviously.
No, it wasn't, and any outlook was different. Aristotle's principles, he was not a Christian, of course, but Aristotle's ethics in its core is something that has to come, for instance, collision course with this also, because implications, whatever he believed in being a man of his time and culture, and a rather cruel culture, he was a pro-Macedonian Greek in the age of Alexander's great conquests and had an idea of this Hellenic superiority and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, Aristotle's great insight, it's not his idea, it's his discovery, and he's not the only one who made this discovery, that being itself is good. This is a very important thing. And you see this in Aristotle, especially when he talks about ethics. This is metaphysical principle. But you find it in Aristotle's ethics, which is not metaphysical ethics. It is what he calls practical philosophy, philosophy of human things, where you can't be that metaphysically accurate. But he says about friendship that friendship stems from the mood, pathe, that is hexis, that in Greek, that man has towards himself. And the man's love, individual man's love towards himself is in fact the love, not egoistic love. He even has those ancient Greeks didn't have this concept of ego like we have. This is the love of being, because the fact that I am reveals the existence to me. Mm-hmm. And this is good. In Aristotle's view, this is absolutely good. And he says, in paraphrase, the sign of this is that no man would give up himself for anything in the world, because everything he wants, he can want only as himself. And the friend is the other man that you transpose this love towards being yourself to him. He calls it, this is where we got the expression alter ego. This means second eye, the other eye. This is Aristotle's expression to define friendship. Although in Aristotle, friendship is not simply body-body relationship, husband and wife relationship. For him is a friendship relationship. The Greek word is philia. It's more like love than friendship. And here you see this idea of the value of goodness of being itself. In this kind of thinking, we see in this infanticide advocacy article, we see the opposite, because they see no value in being, they see only value in their decisions, individual decisions of what is good for me. This is absolutely egoistic kind of thinking, where you have to evolve a distinguishable ego, I, that has plans, wishes, that wants to satisfy its desires and so on and so forth. So the infant or the fetus has no value at all, except if it has value for some grown-up who can use it for something, or I don't know. In traditional thought, and this umbrella term tradition I use for metaphysics, that was expressed by people like on the range from Parmenides, Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas and so forth. The traditional thought is based on the opposite, that there is an inherent truth and beauty in being itself that is not created by man, that is not subjective, but which is discernible and has to be observed if one is to live according to, let's say, the way the world is created. And this kind of thinking rejects it altogether. So when you say that, for instance, infanticide is bad, you say this because you are annihilating a being. You are annihilating something that is that has inherent value. It has a nature, because it is a human being, whether it is as they call it, potential human being or actual human being, you are annihilating a good thing by its, that is good by its very nature, by being human. And this is something they explicitly reject.
It's kind of reminding me a little bit about the Buddhist principle, which is that life is precious. The being is precious because it maybe because it reveals, as you just said, it reveals life. But interestingly, I was also thinking there was two things that came to my mind there. One was that if a being, in their perspective, has to have this power of volition and cognition and continuity of experience and so on, then one could say that somebody asleep or intoxicated is no longer a being, or somebody comatose or mentally deficient is no longer a being. You can extend it exponentially.
Yes, so that's what they call in euthanasia debate. They call this slippery slope. So when you advocate, for instance, in euthanasia, you have the principle of quality of life. If somebody cannot acquire quality of life, he has the right to terminate the life. Or even in some cases, and some people start to argue then that if quality of life is low, then there should be some institution that would decide whether to terminate this creature because it spends energy and so on and so forth. Yeah. And this is This is what they call slippery slope, and it's inevitable, I think, inevitable consequence of this kind of thinking, because there is no inherent limit in in extending this principle, because the purpose of this article was, in fact, to prove that infanticide is no different than abortion, and to expand the abortion principle to already existing children. I mean children that are newborns.
Yeah, one of the reasons I saw one of the possible reasons that I saw as a possible justification for some of this craziness was that as technology evolves and develops, it becomes less and less possible to say that an infant in utero is not human, because it's visibly human much more earlier. So you have to come up with some other justification. You can't just keep saying, oh, it's a blob of cells. It's not human. It's evidently more and more, now from 6-8 weeks they can see that this is human. And this is why there has to be an evolution of new thought or new justification,
I think this demonstrates that argument about pro-abortion argument was never about backstreet abortions and such things, and I always sensed that, because what they want, abortion is not an isolated political issue. It comes in a package with euthanasia issue, with gay marriages issue, and with a certain political, let's say, projects we are in the midst of. In fact, you maybe to a larger extent, being in Ireland, where sustainable development is more effectively implemented. The thing is that when we heard these arguments on abortion, it was always about some rare cases where women's life is in danger and so on. And when you actually legalize abortion, it's rarely about that. It's mostly about ability to have sex without begetting children. I think that numbers are much greater on that side. So I think that the whole story of abortion is simply to put people in the position where their individual personal value will be reduced to nothing. Because you see this in this logic, because they, as you said, they are expanding it. They wrote this article to prove that newborn is no better than a fetus. Fetus is not properly person, ergo both can be killed. And somebody else will say, for instance, in a year or two, that people with, with Down syndrome, even when they come in their 20s, are not really people. And that they are not really persons. So you can kill them also.
It seems to be already there, in the sense of, you have in the Netherlands, isn't it? You've got the Groningen protocol, whereby where they say where there's a hopeless prognosis and intractable pain, that infants may be killed. And in Belgium in 2014 they extended euthanasia to competent minors. So they get to define what a competent minor is. But actually, when you said that about the justifications for abortion, it reminded me that in one of the rebuttal articles, or shall we say the clarification articles that came after the initial article here, the Minerva said that abortion is usually requested for the most serious of reasons. But if you look at any measure of statistics, I mean, in Sweden, for example, 1 in 3 pregnancies ends in abortion, and they would be supposedly very developed in terms of, sex education and awareness and so on and so forth. And in the UK, 1 in 4. In New York City, 41% of all pregnancies end in abortion. So if these are the people who have very serious reasons for aborting, it doesn't actually make sense.
I can tell you one thing. You're absolutely right there. Because it was, as I said, it was never about endangered women. I think this is mostly attack on women, because Women are those that are in the line of fire of this. But I can tell you, for ex-Yugoslavia, for instance, let's say shortly when the war ended, and even during towards the end of the war, there was, I remember in small town when I lived, there were a lot of pregnancies in middle-aged women. It was very noticeable. And this is something that happens apparently in the areas that have this kind of like these catastrophes as wars and so on. I remember reading a commentary of one American woman of these Syrian refugees. Like, what kind of idiots bear children in the war zone, because there is a picture of guy with 2 kids trying to cross Croatian border or Serbian border, I don't remember now. I mean, this woman has no connection to reality whatsoever. I mean, she thinks that people are having children just planning their lives ahead and are not having that people in poorer countries decline to have children until the moment they'll be sure that those children will be expertly provided for. So it is not how it comes about. It is rarely planned even. And a lot of things in our lives are not planned. Some of the things in our lives are destiny, let's say. And this is the concept, those are concepts that I think incomprehensible to people like authors of these articles, yet those concepts reflect the realities of our lives. They are very rarely explained because we live in an age that denies their existence. But people do not deny the existence of those problems. They exist no matter what academics are saying about them. And in this article we see example where Western academia has left. It is pitiable. But to get back to politics, I mean, this idea of abortion is, I think, just a part of something I sometimes seems to me to be some kind of death drive, the push and the intention to base politics on reduction of population and sustainable development. Yeah.
And yet the irony of it is that these authors, both of them in fact, are actually interested in prolonging life. The other end, they're interested in cryonics and cosmetic prolongation of life and the ethics about all of that area. So there actually is a fear of death as well, even though they ethically dispense death to the helpless. They themselves feel so valuable that somehow they should not have to face death, or that they should investigate.
Yeah, that's because they are post-humanist. This is a post-humanist forte. This idea of immortality through cryogenics and merging with machines. The reason for this, I wrote about this extensively in the past. The reason is that because the principle of their thinking, of what they are, is ego. And this is not ego in the psychological but metaphysical sense. For them, ego is a principle. And ego cannot comprehend anything but itself and its projections. Its only consciousness is a consciousness of itself, and it sees itself wherever it looks. And then you have this. For instance, I'll quote you from the end of the article, something that is very related to the thing you said. They are very concerned. They say that potential person, that is the person without consciousness, that is whether a fetus or a baby, has absolutely no value, in a sense that it cannot produce value itself, so it has no moral relevance for actual person. And now they try to relativize this. I will quote. This does not mean that the interests of actual people always override any right of future generations, as we should certainly consider the well-being of people who will inhabit the planet in the future. End quote.
Now, this is the nod to politics, because I don't know whether the authors had in mind the actual definition of sustainable development, but sustainable development, which is a ruling ideology of European Union, is based on this vague principle that you should spend resources in such a way that you don't prevent the capability of future generations to use resources also. Now I complicated very simple definition that I always forget, made by Gro Harlem Brundtland, Norwegian politician. The point is that in a sustainable development we are supposed to kind of like keep the planet intact for future generation, because planet is supposedly, we are overbreeding, we supposedly are enduring human-induced climate change. They used to call it global warming, but they were not able to demonstrate that it's warming. Now they call it climate change. Anyway, this is the way of thinking, that we are always on the brink of impending catastrophe, and that we have to provide for future generation, meaning that we have to curb our own needs somehow. And now they say these future people, that is, people that are not still born, do have rights, whereas babies, actual babies, don't. And now let's see how they argue for this. Quote, "We might still have moral duties towards future generations in spite of these future people not existing yet." So they are potential, absolutely potential. But because we take it for granted that such people will exist, whoever they will be, we must treat them as actual persons of the future. This argument, however, does not apply to this particular newborn or infant, because we are not justifying taking it for granted that she will exist as a person in the future. Whether she will exist is exactly what our choice is about. Now, I don't expect anybody to comprehend this bullshit, but I'll try to break it up. This is completely convoluted, that they are trying to argue the impossible, but it tells us something about this mentality. Now, what she wants to say here, she or he, they wrote it, three pages article written by two people, I mean. But okay, we might still have more, so they say we have a moral duty towards what they call potential persons. Mm-hmm. If and only if we cannot pinpoint them as actual persons. Now, this is what they mean. This one baby, for instance, I got my spouse pregnant, and now we are choosing what to do with the baby. And now this actual fetus, this potential person that is this little knowledge fetus or newborn, has no moral value. Precisely because it is actual. I mean, I don't know how, because it is a living, breathing being. Whereas the people of the future are idea in their heads. The future generation has a value. The actual human being does not have a value. This is the point. This is something I don't think this was intended consequence of the argument, but this is what it amounts to. And this is very typical for leftists, not only for leftists, but I'd say radical left has this kind of thinking, because in my experience, from all those leftists I knew, I never met people who despise, so utterly loathe the working man, actual working man. Whereas the whole ideology they live by is built upon the idea of fighting for the working man. Mm-hmm. This is because this is the way of thinking when you don't think reality, but you think the system of concepts you have in your head.
I'm just wondering, sorry to interrupt you, I was just wondering that you were saying that about the extreme egotism that exists in this kind of post-humanist thinking. If they can only conceive of people in the head because when you actually meet people on the street, in a way it invades your space and it takes away, it shows, it demonstrates to you that there are actually other people existing beyond yourself. And so therefore that's kind of unpleasant to contemplate. So it's much easier to contemplate imaginary people that you can do good for than to actually do something good for the person that's in front of you. Mm-hmm. That was just...
Yes, this is it. But this is not something that is kind of like that you could take some people who are egoistic and so on and so forth. This is the ruling ideology, a ruling metaphysics of the age. From the times of roughly Hegel, maybe, not that Hegel was a metaphysical egoist, but for instance, his philosophy is based on this idea of absolute I. That was the age called classical German idealism, the time of beginning of 19th century, when there was this great boom of philosophy in Germany, initiated partly by Kant, attempt to go beyond Kant. But the principle, the principle they took as a starting point was this principle of absolute I, that true freedom is I, that I is free, and that the thing that has to be demonstrated is how non-I, that is the object, what is outside the consciousness, is also an I, that everything is conscious, that everything is subject, in a sense. And of course, at that time, in these German philosophers, it was something different. They never advocate for something like that. But that principle of a split between subject and object is something that rules our age, and it rules academia, and it rules the scientific way of thinking. So this is the reason why ideas like this can find their way in academia with no problem, because however loathsome one can find them, people, I think reviewers just accept their formal logic they use, because they see nothing wrong. In the age of I don't know, high Middle Ages, they would face I think a very long time in the dungeon or something worse, simply because, not because people were more primitive, but because people were aware that there are more fundamental things than subject and object. There is more fundamental thing than my I, than my personal aims, and so on and so forth. And so I think this is very serious, in fact. Not that this article is so serious in itself, but the serious thing is that this is the way of thinking that could be appropriated by the masses. And in the West, as far as I have seen, it is appropriated to a large extent already.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The whole principle of the I. I didn't know about that one.
Need to have a trick, then you make both. Honey, you need to shake your tune so it fits in every hole. You need to auto-tune and sell your soul. I won't give my music to the industry. I won't take a hit from the factory. Hate it, I love it, you can have mine for free. The whole music business is unsatisfactory. Build your fan base, define your style, stick a brand on your face, and learn how to smile. Don't risk a single change, that might scare off your fans. Sounds too funny or strange, your manager will ban. I won't give my music to the industry. I won't take a hit from the factory. Hate it, I love it, you can have mine for free. The whole music business is unsatisfactory.
Yeah, I suppose I was going to ask, is there a way back? But I actually want to ask that question in a few minutes, because I wanted to go back to, you mentioned about it being an attack on women, and one of the things that I find ironic is how abortion has affected women proportionally much worse than it has affected men. Not not the actual act of abortion, but in terms of demographics, in terms of sex selective abortions, and how women have been the great losers demographically, in the sense that the female sex is less wanted and therefore more aborted much more frequently. So it surprises me that, given that there are in India and China alone 100 million missing women, so-called, in the last 20-30 years, that there isn't a very big response from women to this. It's extremely insulting, and yet it's still approached by women as this, you know, your right to do with what you want with your own body. That surprises me. So maybe I will go on then to the question of what is the way back from this great I attitude?
Yes, it's a way back to reality. I don't think that we is maybe not a good term, but a lot of people never departed from reality. A lot of people will react negatively to this still. It is a question, because reality is not material reality. Plethora of philosophers, New Agers and such in 20th century tried to prove that there is some reality behind material reality, but the fact of the matter is that, metaphysically speaking, the reality that is the being is not material. It couldn't be all-encompassing, it couldn't be self-subsistent, and so on and so forth. There are logical reasons and ontological reasons why, when you say that you are in touch in reality, you don't mean you are in touch with the cupboard or something, but you are in touch with the wholeness in some sense. And this expression common sense is in fact discloses it in some way, although most people live in the vague understanding of reality, the vague understanding of being. They kind of like feel it, feel the value, feel the right and wrong, and so on and so forth, because reality itself gives us, I believe, the right and the criteria of right and wrong, of beautiful and ugly, of truth and a lie, and so on and so forth. And the only thing is, and it is disclosed through the voice of conscience, of one's conscience, and if one is attentive to it from the early age, then at least individually he will not get enmeshed into this. But there are, I think, points in life when you get tested somehow, when you find yourself in situations where you have to make decisions, whether practical, whether intellectual decisions about what your place in the world is, what you believe, and so on and so forth. If you make a right choice, that this inner voice, it's not voice, it's this inner goading, pushes you towards, you will go towards the right direction. If not, then you can fall into this. So I don't think that that this kind of thinking has any strength in itself. It has strength in being accepted, and it is being accepted mostly in the indirect ways, through media and through, above all, through movies, through entertainment. And I do think that at least semi-intentionally we get this kind of death worship messages in a form of images, or in a form of poetry, in a form of culture, not in the form of these dry arguments. And little by little people accept them. This is danger. But if people can make themselves aware what are they accepting, they will at least inwardly reject it. And this is the only thing I know that can be done. This is something that one man can do. The other is, of course, political push against it. But in politics, I don't believe in grassroots politics. In grassroots movement, I believe in elites. not in elites so much in the sense of somebody's birthright to rule, but I do believe that mass movements devolve into their own opposites inevitably. You have to have strong institutions that push against this. One of those in the West used to be Catholic Church. It is still not eroded. I don't think it will ever be, but it is on its hind legs, to use an ugly word. It is constantly under attack. And when you abstract these factual things that are brought as charges against Catholic Church, if you just try to make a mental experiment and try to objectively observe what is the most attacked institution in the West, it will end up that this is Catholic Church. On this level, this is the level of UN. You will never hear something like this about UN. And the whole of this talk, we are talking about something that is fairly UN-worthy policy, because UN is built upon neo-Malthusian ideas, as you know better than me, on theosophical ideas, among other things. And let us not forget that Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh, her partner, were pioneers of neo-Malthusianism and abortion rights. And these are ideas, this is where these ideas come from. And you would need a strong institutions that push against this. Those institutions, or those, let's say, political movements, would not be kind of like Knights of the Round Table. They would push back in a political sense, and this means sometimes, or most of the time, by pure inertia, because these monolithic hierarchical structures, like churches, they have these principles, dogmas that cannot be changed. And when you come to attack some society with ideas as expressed in this article, the very stubborn existence of those dogmas wears them out, because people follow dogmas. Not all the people follow them as they should be followed. No, when you have the principle, love thy neighbor. If you have a country where this is a principle, neighbors will still be at feuds with one another, but will know deep inside that they are wrong. This is the point. And when you attack such society with these ideas, you can attack for some time, but you'll get worn out. You won't succeed. But if these ideas that are enshrined in these institutions are removed, you are sitting duck, because this will become principle.
But that didn't work here, did it? I mean, with the passage of the abortion referendum at 67% or whatever, it didn't work here.
No, I know it didn't work in Ireland. It didn't work spectacularly.
Yeah.
In Croatia, for instance, it is, and I'm talking from this Croatian East European, typical East European experience. I'm trying to put in words this kind of like experience of politics in the Balkans, which is always a messy, sordid affair, but can have some good consequences.
Are you not in a way talking about a strongman kind of politics?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It depends. For instance, in Balkans, I think it kind of like always, it always ends up with something like that, not in dictatorial sense, but in the sense that you have highly conservative institutions that tend to be highly corrupted also, because those are poor countries and everybody is going into politics with approaching politics thinking about some gain for him and his family. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that Eastern European societies are inert, and the inertia and stubbornness kind of like pushes out these new ideas. They push out good ideas also, but these crazy ideas, they kind of like don't stick. For instance, in Croatia, people who are pushing against gay marriages and such things are not people whom I like, are people who I don't even support, but they are pushing back. And they are formulating the sentiment of the people with this. And the trouble is that people understand politics idealistically, because we have this underlying idea of progress, that is that we are capable of infinitely perfecting ourselves, mainly through politics, by perfecting societies. This idea is, I think, complete nonsense. This is 200 years old idea. I don't think it applies at all. The real goodness of human life is something that transcends politics and is not really tied to this temporal life. It is something that transcends human life. It's a promise of something greater than what we are. And this idea is secularized now in this idea of progress. And when people think politics, they always think about politics as an attempt to bring the ultimate good. They can't imagine that people, for instance, like some East European politician like Viktor Orban in Hungary, they say he's a jerk, he's corrupted, so on and so forth. Therefore, his politics is entirely bad. No, the problem is that it's a win some, lose some game. For instance, Hungary has, let's say, some higher degree of sovereignty in some things. People are shielded from some things. Some things are terrible. Believe me, as a person who grew up in Ireland, okay, you remember Ireland from much worse economical times, but somebody like your children who grew up in these practically in boom times, if I understand correctly, times of Celtic Tiger, or if you put them in a country like Hungary or, God forbid, Croatia or something like Bosnia, and they try to seek jobs, not like citizens of European Union, but as locals do, they will be appalled.
I was thinking about Viktor Orban when you were talking earlier on about the need for somebody to stand strong or whatever, or the strong elite movement. But I do think, though, that in the event of economic progress, you may find that some of these staunch and stable ethical and moral positions may crumble. That's possible.
Yes. And this is the question that I always formulate like this: if I exercise my demons, will my angels live too? This is the dilemma you have in Eastern Europe, because I am very acutely aware that what I hated the most in this country of mine, for the most part of my life, because I grew up in the 90s, which was not a good time to grow up here, but well, the things I hated the most now, I realize protected us the most from the things that you, for instance, were not protected. And in a sense, it preserved some kind of continuity with the past, and people never really detached from some principles, and probably will not, because this prosperity of the West is now showing its age. It's showing this liberal ideology is kind of like not on the end of its tether, but it's starting to show the cracks.
Sure.
It's not appealing as it was.
Yeah.
And we were saved from some, I think, ultimate failings by our own inertia, by our backwardness, stubbornness. And this is, well, I guess that's how it is with politics. I think idealizing politics and utopian thinking is the surest way to hell. This does not mean that one should just embrace political corruption as something that should be. I never tried to enter politics precisely because I am incapable of sharing the mentality of Croatian politician, even at the lowest level of this local politics. I don't have it in me. But I do recognize that this is the reason why I, for instance, am useless in this sector. And this is normal. You are good at some things, you can be useful there, but in politics, for instance, there are people who are able to make thousands of compromises, to be hypocrites when needed, but even in the midst of all this, do one essential good thing maybe. Mm-hmm. And then they should be supported. So it's as I'm trying to show here, there is no like systemic answer to a political answer, something like this. The practical answer is rejection and subversion and sabotage of politics that lead us to the direction of this article, and ideologies. And these ideologies entail gay marriages, euthanasia, legislature, abortion, and of course now as we see abortion expanded to infanticide. Those things I think have to be rejected unequivocally, while other things can be debated or not. And how they will be rejected we'll see. I mean, I don't like the possibility of radical right-wing responses, but the further this goes, the more radical the answer will be, and it will come mechanically in some societies at least. I don't think it will happen in Ireland as of, from what I noticed, Irish are more or less content with their situations, but in other places in the world it's not such thing. I mean, in Croatia, and I don't know, somebody like these two authors, I wouldn't be in their shoes if they would live here and write something like that. Although in Italy also, this girl is an Italian, although she doesn't live in Italy. In Italy she would not fare well with this kind of ideas.
Well, she's in the University of Ghent, I think it is in Belgium, which is a country that's very open to this kind of thing. Yeah, I thought it was interesting the way you said that maybe Croatia has kind of leapfrogged over the economic development, the attractions of it all, because it never experienced it. It's actually experiencing the downfall of the. It can look outside and learn in that way. So perhaps it is, because I had been thinking to myself, well, it's inevitable. It's almost like it's a cycle that's inevitable. But maybe if people actually view outside and see the consequences, perhaps it's not inevitable.
I don't know. I'm not prone to being fatalist, but I don't like, for instance, ideas that you need a catastrophe to change things, and this is very prevalent idea among people. Apocalyptic way of thinking. I don't like it one bit. But there are boundaries that are pushed very far, I think, in our day and age. Now, this single article is not such a novelty as it may seem to somebody who never encountered this kind of thinking. But when you look at posthumanists, who are as a movement rather influential, I think, rather influential in politics of multinationals like Google, or corporations like Google, because I think Ray Kurzweil is still a Google employee. Then you see that some boundaries are pushed. We are the main services that we cannot kind of like isolate from in our daily lives are run by people who think in this manner. Mm-hmm. And when boundaries are pushed in such manner, some radical changes will happen, I think.
One of the problems, though, is that the tireless advance of technology means that more and more difficult issues are thrown up. And, for example, one of the things that I read about recently was the idea of don't know what it's called. It's to do with external wombs. And there was a doctor recently, or a bioethicist saying recently that within 10 years we would have external wombs, so it's related in that sense. So the problem is that the relentless advance of technology throws up these issues, and in a way we can't not consider them because they're going to happen anyway.
Yeah, we'll see about that. The problem is, I think we'll see, what my intuition is about these things is that what we are already observing is the return of what is opposite to all this. Now, I was arguing from the beginning of our talk, I was talking about soul, about spirit, substance, in very unapologetic terms. 30 years ago, I probably wouldn't do so, first of all, because I was 13 then and I didn't know anything, but some philosopher 30 years ago would not have felt so free. The reason being is that these technological progress, which has the whole acceleration of the free fall, in my opinion, because nothing moves so fast as a free fall, is kind of like progressively displaying its own absurdity. It is getting in the field of science fiction, and science fiction that can now supposedly become reality. And we are starting to question what the reality is. Now, the usual argument against people like authors of this article is that you take some facts, statistical facts or biological facts that refutes them. I don't even consider doing something like that. I'm refuting them from the standpoint of Middle Ages. And I don't feel in any way at loss by doing that, because I was probably not as consequent in my refutation now as I would be if I wrote article myself, concentrated, and I assure you I would refute it, and I think my arguments would be accepted, and my arguments would be more or less the same arguments Thomas Aquinas would put. Now, this was impossible 30 years ago. This is a very interesting thing. And there are people who are aware what this means. One of them, for instance, is Alexander Dugin, the man who is rightfully reviled in the West and in the Russia, but in some corners, but is constantly underestimated by his opponents. This is very profoundly intelligent man, not because he is well educated. I think because he, let's say, this is a kind of man that had a catharsis in his life, in the opposite way of catharsis should be. I think this is the man who took a peek behind appearances and saw the wrong thing. Let's leave it at that. But what he said, for instance, in his fourth political theory, he said that nowadays you can take any traditional, let's say, past idea, political or religious idea, as for instance Russia as a third Rome, as a successor to Byzantium with the right to rule over the world because it is a holy empire and so on and so forth. He also said you can take pagan warrior gods and he said put them on your shield, you will not look absurd. And he's right, because this is postmodernity. This is the age of the dissolution of the ideology of materialism, of the idea that human intellect has a human, not intellect in general, because human intellect is not only intellect in this world, that human intellect is the acme of everything. And now these past trains, past movers of history that were considered to be dead are waking again. They were not dead. It was a very brief moment of this modernity and belief in progress in science that is now coming, in my opinion, coming to being to fall and being crushed in million pieces. This something that they see as a acceleration of progress Moore's law, that this is geometrically progressing, is, in my opinion, a free fall, because it's falling in absurdity. They can invent all they imagine. For instance, I read today that Chinese made a new moon and will rocket it out into space. I don't care. Their logic fails. When your logic fails, when your mind fails, you are done for. And these are people that are terminally metaphysically warped. They are stupid in the sense that it's not psychological. This is metaphysical stupidity. This is when angel gets stupid, or some kind of deity. This is this kind of stupidity. And I think that we are into situation that it will be progressively revealed to us that there are many alternatives, and that this is only a kind of like brief historical period in which we grew up. It's coming to an end, and that the unresolved realities of history are coming to the fore. So, for instance, I gave you an example. Russians want to be Third Rome. Not only Russians want to be that. This is something that is peculiar to Eastern Christianity and some of these Eastern churches and peoples that are conflated with the churches, in the sense that church is in fact a national project, that have this idea of continuing the Byzantium, of taking the mantle of Byzantium. 30 years ago, somebody would laugh at this idea. They would say, "But we are all progressives now. We don't do these things." Well, no, those things are still at large, and are still moving history. Whereas these ideas, as this liberal utopia of globalism, is, I think, dead. It is dead in itself, intellectually dead, but it will cause effects still by inertia in the future. But I don't think 20 or 30 years from now, who knows, maybe we will laugh at the idea of globalism. I think it's very possible. So
that would be interesting. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
The idea of a constant trajectory outwards, onwards into the sci-fi future is very challenging to think about.
I think that science fiction is just one form that is born, form of understanding the world, that comes about when a mind detaches itself from reality. The first science fiction writer was philosopher Anaxagoras, pre-Socratic philosopher, that is one of the most ancient ones, who had an idea that two principles in this world are nous, or mind, and homeomeria. Homeomeria means things of equally measured things. Something like that is my free translation. And these homeomeria are in vortex, chaotic vortex. They are some kind of particles. Something. And the mind is the principle that puts them together and creates the world practically out of this vortex of homeomeria. He was the first man to say that there are other earths among the stars with other people standing to their kettle as the Greek did, and so on and so forth. And they can be probably, I don't remember now exactly, they said that there are infinite worlds and so on and so forth. This idea never struck Plato, who wrote after Anaxagoras and who was very well aware of his philosophy. This means one thing, that science fiction, this kind of fiction, intellectual fiction, is a mindset. It is a mindset built on the mind which detached itself from reality and is free to reform in his imagination this reality in all possible forms. But those forms are in fact inexistent. I mean, when you look at science fiction, it is never about reality. It is always about imagining things that are like our own reality in some way. They try to make it, sometimes when they kind of like get philosophical, they try to warp it all into something incomprehensible. Like, for instance, you have Stanislav Lem, a Polish science fiction writer who wrote Solaris. You may have heard about it. There is a film by Tarkovsky about intelligent ocean. So they come, cosmonauts come to this planet with intelligent ocean, and they cannot get in touch with it, communicate with it, because it takes from their subconscious their sins that then haunt them, and so on and so forth. Now, this is considered like intelligent science fiction. I think it's complete bullshit. There is no such thing as intelligent ocean. How can an ocean be intelligent? It cannot be. And science fiction is based on this, using some random qualities of things that you then mix in a way to tell a story. And it is good. It is okay when you don't take it seriously. But today it is taken seriously to an extreme extent. And science fiction thinking is kind of like prevalent in these popularizers of science, like, I don't know, Richard, what his name was, this in wheelchair physicist,
Stephen
English
Hawking.
physicist.
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking.
Yeah.
I mean, that man, what man wrote about philosophical questions is a level of elementary school kid. And this is the pure science fiction. This is what I wanted to say. And I mean, science that devolves in science fiction, no matter how successful it can be, it lost its mind. Mm-hmm. And when science lost its mind, it is not science anymore. So.
I'm going to try and formulate something. What I want to say is something that's hard to express, but it's something that recurs to me again and again when faced with the alternatives to present day liberalism and postmodernism. Is often offered this reversion or recurring to a more traditional mode of thinking. And for example, you brought up Thomas Aquinas there, okay? And you said that 30 years ago you wouldn't have felt like arguing on behalf of the soul, etc., and that this is becoming more and more common, this idea that older ideas can resurge, shall we say, ideas that might have been for a very long time and that were disturbed in some way by this postmodern liberalism. Now, as a woman, right, one of the things that I find a little bit scary about that idea is that while I very much, from my own point of view, appreciate what could be called traditional metaphysics, I've been interested in yoga for 30 years and I've studied very deeply in that area, and I appreciate a lot of other traditional metaphysics like Taoism and so on. But what I'm actually saying is that often the place of women in these traditional societies was not very attractive, or it doesn't appear to me to have been very attractive. So while there may be a reaction against the insanity of, say, a proposition such as after-birth abortion, if we react too strongly, and a lot of, I'm trying to formulate this now, but I would fear that would it not be that some idea of a regressive existence or life for women would actually come to the fore? This is quite justified fear, because maybe I was not clear about my position. I'm not talking about reacting for myself. I'm talking about just business as usual. For instance, I don't know why Thomas Aquinas always
comes to the fore with me, that's because whole last year I'm reading him. But those ideas, what he has are not ideas. He's disclosing reality. He's one of those thinkers in the history of mankind. Then you see that he's in fact telling you what you already know, but he's formulating it for you. These are realities. These are not abstract concepts. But for me, it only means that you just re-embrace the reality. This is non-action, in fact. If I advocate anything in this world, it is non-action, not action, but non-action of pulling out of that race. Reaction, on the other hand, is something that everybody should fear, because reaction. I saw, for instance, reaction to this excessive political correctness and this madness, social justice warriors. You have alt-right. Alt-right is horrible reaction. Alt-right is even worse. You have Donald Trump, who is taken as a symbol of chaos, as a symbol of complete irreverence. So you were pushed in the false reverence towards all those minority groups and so on and so forth. And now your reaction is absolute irreverence towards everything. This is, I'm talking now about internet movement. If we would have a reactionary reforming of societies and imposing, kind of like trying to recreate old patterns of society artificially, that's a terrible thing. You can't do that. That's something that can be done only violently. Societies change, as Nietzsche said. I don't remember. I can't translate it in English from top of my head. What he said: the world never turned around the inventors of noise. The world turns around in silence. The things change around in action, not action, in my opinion. Especially not revolutionary action. You can't have traditionalist revolutionary. I wrote about this, having Dugin, for instance, in mind, because he's a good example, and I kind of like always had a feeling that I understand his motives and understand what pains him, that guy. And this is the man that is completely beyond good and evil. He's got absolutely no scruples. And his idea is revolutionary destruction of postmodern, or in fact modern world. And that world will not end in itself. It has to end, but we have to push it. This means, in his terminology, a global war. And anybody who comes with this kind of mentality has nothing to do with tradition. You cannot oppose evil. This is the principle. Evil is not to be opposed. And this is something people hate to hear. But this is fundamental Christian principle. And this is the principle that made Christianity in institutional form survive unbelievable 2,000 years. It didn't survive because Constantine the Great made it state religion. It didn't survive because of crusades. It didn't survive in Eastern Europe because of Austro-Hungarian Empire. It survived precisely because of this. Because you had one measly carpenter crucified on the cross, who nobody knew about. From the historical point of view, nobody was recording such things. Why? But in 300 years, the religion was already on trajectory of informing the whole of Europe. Now, how this comes to pass? This can come to pass only by principles that are above human, and what humans can do, in my opinion, is, plainly speaking, let go. Not act. Forgive. Forgiveness, for instance, is, I think, one maybe most powerful act one can do. And it is a non-act. Also, in some way, it's kind of like renouncing of doing something, renouncing of judging, precisely when you have right to judge. and you renounce it. It is not easy to do. It is not easy to comprehend what it is. It is not just forgiveness. Is not, in my opinion, not simply an act of somebody did me wrong, so I forgive him his wrong. Forgiveness is when somebody did you wrong and then you seek what he did right. Maybe not to you, but to somebody else. And for this good you find in him, you renounce passing sentence on bad that he did or that he has in himself. And this means that you cling exclusively, look exclusively to the good. And this means trying to look at God. This I think is forgiveness. And being capable of this is tremendous success. I am not capable of it. I mean, it's much harder than rising revolutions. So
I totally agree. The only thing is, say, for example, in the context of this articles, how does one apply such an attitude?
I think there is no application in this sense because these people are beyond people. Look, personally, I don't think that they are that important. It's only the question how much they identify with what they think. If they do, and I think they are completely detached from themselves also. Mm-hmm. There is nothing to forgive because they put themselves beneath the human level. And I'm not saying this in anger, it's just the logic of their argument is making them subhuman. They call it posthuman because they want to become posthuman. If this girl wants to live forever in some kind of melding with the machine or something like that, or cryogenics or whatever, she is renouncing her humanity, her finitude, because finitude and death are what defines us. It defines our temporal being, mm-hmm. our time, because our time of our life is what we are, I think, for the most part. This is what discloses the truth to us, because every realization comes from time, in a way, from meaning that emanates through time, and that's why we are always kind of like late, realizing things late, but you kind of feel that some part of big picture, of big meaning is being revealed even in your defeats. But these people reject this. They reject the fundamental humanity. There's nothing to forgive, there's nothing to condemn. I think that they should be, the ideal case would be that they should be left to themselves to go into way of dispersion, of identifying with animals, minerals or whatever, because this is what they are doing. They are not upstanding, they are descending.
That's true. Yeah, they in fact want to be left to themselves in a way. They think that what they discuss anyway has supposedly no relevance for ordinary people, so they want to be left to themselves. Yeah, is there any other area on the topic of the paper that you feel like we've left out?
Well, the only thing that struck my eye is something I already mentioned. It is freely accessible. That's interesting. That's something I would recommend to people listening to this to have in mind, because this is not not really customary in academic publishing, and maybe this text was used as some kind of balloon, test balloon for reaction.
Kite
maybe
flying.
I'm speculating. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I thought that there was a possibility of kite flying. I also thought that, personally, I found them I looked at their Twitter accounts and stuff like that, but in general, like often these people, and I'm not just talking about these two, but there is something insubstantial about them as people. Perhaps they're looking for relevance.
Yeah. I think insubstantiality is kind of like a word that best sums up the whole issue of this article, because logically they start from the idea of insubstantiality of everything, and they themselves are insubstantial. So, well, what one can say, and this is by the way in normal metaphysics definition of evil, being insubstantial, deprived of existence, because existence is good. And these people are on the way of doing this to themselves, I think.
So in a sense, some of the ideas are actually projections then from their own insubstantiality, because if the neonatal infant or the in utero child is insubstantial in their point of view, it's maybe perhaps projection of their own feeling about themselves.
Maybe. I wouldn't go psychologizing them too much, but a kind of like logical consequence of this kind of thinking is that you yourself were not a substance when you were a child, and this is something the authors say in the article. So if their mothers aborted them, they wouldn't do nothing bad to them because they didn't exist. They still haven't been these well-developed academics with their aims and wishes and desires. Yeah. So that's interesting, and you are right to know this, because by denigrating humanity in this way, they denigrate themselves also. This is kind of like self-flagellating, kind of like doing violence to somebody else while doing violence to yourself at the same time. Something apparently that happens in hell, as I hear, but I wouldn't go that far. But this sadomasochist dialectics is kind of like what hell is understood, like in Christianity. I wouldn't be. Anyway, I wouldn't toy with such ideas. People can come up with all kinds. Immature people can come up with all sorts of shocking ideas, and maybe in their real life not being really believing them. But this is kind of ideas I would not play with, because ideas can kill you. Or they can take you by the hand and lead you over the precipice. And this is this kind of idea, because infanticide is no joke. Once you are advocating something like that, I mean.
Sometimes I wonder, when I read such things, how those people may feel later on in their life, perhaps in their 50s, 60s, 70s, or perhaps before death. They might feel this desire to retract or to rethink ideas. That often happens. People who have these very controversial ideas, they rebut them later on, but yet there's been a damage done in the first place by them expressing the ideas. But then I suppose the question is, how much influence do these people have? Perhaps they don't have that much at all.
These two probably don't, but Peter Singer does have big influence, and not only him. Institutions are built around ideas congenial to this. I mean, I always say UN, NGOs that are, most of the NGOs that have some relation to European Union, not all. I know very good NGOs, for instance, fighting for consumer rights, and so on and so forth in this system of European Union. You in Ireland have Katy Sinot. She was, I think, member of European Parliament even. And but most of the civil sector advocacy groups for human rights, which is what a paradox, are in fact based on such ideas, not in this radical form. They are not aware of this, but are based on this logic. All sustainable development is like that. Abortion advocacy is mostly, in fact, this, only less radical. And this, there you have it. So these ideas are prevalent, for instance.
I was reading a bit of Peter Singer's work, and I came across one of his tenets was that wantedness is the distinguisher between those who should live and those who should not. The wantedness of that person, of that being, because he doesn't actually recognize them as a person, but the wantedness of them. And if you think about it, in our lives, at any time, any human being can go through a period of being unwanted. So therefore, it's a completely amorphous, infinite. It's an illimitable idea, wantedness.
Yeah, so. Yeah. There is nothing that can limit the implications of it. You have lookism. This girl is expert on lookism. That's what the idea of discrimination by way of looks. If somebody tells me that I'm butt ugly, I have, I don't know, you get him euthanized or something. I mean, this is unbelievable self-indulgence. Unbelievable self-indulgence. The first thing you learn in adolescence is to devise thick skin against such things. You have to. I know it's not easy to go through life with what is given to you. We are born. Some are born with Down syndrome. They are interesting. Those children with Down syndrome are seemingly the main target for some reason, for this. But those people tend to be very good morally. I remember one girl with Down syndrome I knew a long time ago. She was not good because she was simple. She was actively good. She was good because she knew what it means to be good. So, what the hell? Yeah. I mean, interesting to note one thing about lookism and this idea that you should not denigrate anybody's looks. You have these Down syndrome supermodels, advocacy of Down syndrome people like a standard of beauty, which is idiotic. That is, I bet you that that such idea is promoted by those people who want Down syndrome children aborted. It's completely, it's seeming contradiction, but it's not contradiction because it's, when you go into nihilism, when you go into nothingness, there is only one nothingness, no matter what form it gets. So you can use all kind of contradictory, you can contradict yourself as much as you want. So.
Yeah, so it seems. So it seems.